What is free software? Free software is software that respects your freedom and your community. So it's free as in freedom, not as in price. Price is a side issue. We're not talking about that. We're talking about freedom. We're talking about an ethical issue. So to understand the meaning of free in free software, think of free speech, not free beer. When a program is not free, we call it non-free software, proprietary software, user subjugating software. Because a proprietary program implements a system of digital colonization. And like any colonial system, it keeps the users divided and helpless. Divide and rule, that's how colonialism works. So the users are divided because they're forbidden to redistribute to others, and they're helpless because they don't have the source code, so they can't change the program, and they can't even tell what it's really doing to them. However, what I've said is too general. It's easy to say, I believe in freedom, we stand for freedom. Even Bush said that he stood for freedom, and Bush couldn't recognize freedom even before he crushed it. So, I better be more specific. A program is free software if you, the user, have the 4 essential freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program as you wish. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code of the program and change it so it does your computing as you wish. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help others, to redistribute exact copies to others when you wish. And freedom 3 is the freedom to contribute to your community. That's the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions to others when you wish. So if the program gives you these 4 freedoms, then it's free software, because the social system of using and distributing the program is an ethical system, one that respects the user's freedom and community. But if one of these freedoms is missing or insufficient, then the program is proprietary user subjugating software, because it imposes an unethical social system on the users. Thus, the distinction between free and proprietary software is not a technical distinction. It's not about what job the code does, not directly, although there may be a relationship. It's not about how the code was written or how it works. It's about the social system for using and distributing the program. So it's an ethical, social, and political decision, not a technical distinction, not a technical distinction. And that's why it's so important, more important than any mere technical distinction would be. The use of a free program in society is development, because the free program is knowledge whose users are free to study it and understand it, and then maintain it, adapt it, and extend it to other uses. But the use of a proprietary program in society is not development, it's dependence. So it makes society worse. To develop a free program is a contribution to society. How much of a contribution? That depends on the details. To develop a proprietary program is not a contribution, it's a power grab. The proprietary program, in social terms, is a trap. People become users and they lose their freedom. If the program has attractive features, those are the bait for the trap. They attract users to give up their freedom and fall under the control of the developer. So those attractive features don't make the program better, they make it more dangerous. So if you have a choice to develop a proprietary program or do nothing at all, it's better if you do nothing at all, because that way you're not doing any harm. And thus the goal of the free software movement is that all software should be free so that all the users of software can be free. However, why define free software this way? Why are these four freedoms essential? Each freedom has a reason. Freedom 2, the freedom to help others, to distribute copies of your modified versions, is essential on fundamental moral grounds, so you can live an upright, ethical life as a good member of your community. If you use a program that lacks freedom 2, then you're in danger of falling into a moral dilemma. Whenever your good friend says, "That program is nice, could I have a copy?" What are you going to do then? You will face a choice between two evils. One evil is to give your friend a copy and violate the license of the program. The other evil is to refuse your good friend a copy and comply with the license of the program. If you are in this dilemma, you ought to choose the lesser evil, which is to give your friend a copy and violate the license of the program. Why is this the lesser evil? If you have to choose between doing wrong to various different people, it's less bad if you do wrong to somebody who deserves it because he has done wrong. We can assume that your good friend is a good member of your community and normally deserves your cooperation. By contrast, the developer of the proprietary program has deliberately attacked the social solidarity of your community, deliberately tried to split you from them. So, if you can't avoid doing wrong to your friend or the developer, do it to the developer. However, being the lesser evil does not mean it is good. It's never good to make an agreement and break it. Not even an evil agreement like this one, for which keeping it is worse than breaking it. Still, breaking it is not good. And if you give your friend a copy, what will she have? She will have an unauthorized copy of a proprietary program. And that's a nasty thing, not because it's unauthorized, but because it's proprietary. It's almost as bad as an authorized copy. So, once you have fully understood this issue, what should you really do? You should make sure you are never in this dilemma. I know two ways. One is don't have any friends. That's what the proprietary developers have in mind for you. The other, my way, is reject the software that denies you freedom too. Refuse to use it. When someone offers me a program on the condition that I not share it with you, I say, my conscience does not permit me to accept those conditions, so get your nasty program out of here. And I don't have that software. I won't take it. And that's what you should do also. Reject software that denies essential freedom too. And reject also the propaganda terminology that the proprietary developers use to demonize cooperation. Terms like pirate. When they call people who share pirates, what are they really saying? They want us to believe and assume, preferably without careful thought, that sharing with other people is the moral equivalent of attacking a ship. Other propaganda terms they use are theft. Copying is not theft, but they call it theft. It's a distorted picture. So when people ask me, when they say, well, but morally speaking, it's wrong to equate helping other people with attacking ships, because attacking ships is very bad, but helping other people is good. So we shouldn't call them by the same name. Therefore, when people ask me what I think of piracy, I say attacking ships is very bad. So I pointedly reject their propaganda meaning of the term. And that's what you should do too. So that's the reason for freedom too, the freedom to help others, the freedom to redistribute exact copies of the program to others when you wish. Essential on fundamental moral grounds. Freedom 0, the freedom to run the program as you wish, is essential for a different reason. So you can control your computing. There are proprietary programs whose licenses restrict the running of the copies that people, even authorized copies, the people who use them are not using them freely. For instance, I heard about a program for managing websites whose license forbids using it to publish anything that criticizes the program's developer. In this case, proprietary software literally takes away the user's freedom of speech. Obviously, if you can't even freely run the program on the machines you choose in the way you choose, then you don't control your computing. So freedom 0 is essential. But it's not enough, because that means you're free to either do or not do whatever the code of the program is already set up to do. Therefore, the developer continues controlling what you can do, not through the license if you have freedom 0, but instead through the code itself. So in order to control your computing, you need freedom 1, the freedom to study the source code and then change it so the program does your computing as you wish. This way you decide instead of letting the developer impose his decisions on you. If you don't have freedom 1, you can't even tell what the program really does. You can't check, because the only way to thoroughly check is with the source code. And it's quite common for proprietary programs to have malicious features that are designed not to serve the user, but instead to spy on the user, restrict the user, even attack the user. And this is not a rare thing. It's not like the danger that you might get in a car accident today. Yes, it might happen, but it isn't likely to happen. Most days you go out and there's no car accident. But with proprietary software, most of the users are using programs that have features to hurt them. One proprietary package that has all three of those kinds of malicious features that you might have heard of is called Microsoft Windows. People have found spy features that send information about the use of the machine. Microsoft admits the features to restrict the users, which are called Digital Restrictions Management, DRM, or digital handcuffs. These are the features that restrict what users can do with the data in their own computers. It's not easy to find the back doors, but people have found them. For instance, one of the back doors in Windows allows Microsoft to forcibly install changes in the software. Any software in the machine, Microsoft can forcibly change it without asking permission of the theoretical owner of the computer. I say theoretical because once Microsoft has Windows running in the computer, Microsoft has owned that computer. Windows is malware. It's just as malicious as a virus. And any malicious feature that Windows does not have today could be forcibly installed tomorrow. So one must look at Windows as unlimited malware. There is no limit on how malicious it might be. But Windows is not unique. Macintosh is also malware because it implements digital handcuffs. And the newer Apple products are pioneers in attacking the user's freedom. Products like the iMoan and the iPad. Because Apple has taken control even over the installation of applications. Users are not even free to install their choice of application programs. Oh no, Apple limits them to whatever programs Apple approves. And there is a back door. Apple used that back door to forcibly delete applications that were already installed in the iMoan. We don't know what else that back door can do. We know this one thing because people observed it happening. So the iMoan and the iPad are malware. And then there's the Adobe Flash Player, which has a surveillance feature and digital handcuffs. The surveillance feature lets various websites work together to identify the user and track the user. It enables one site to write data into the user's Flash Player, and then another site can read it. In general, this is similar to browser cookies, but the difference is browsers give users control over accepting cookies. The Flash Player gives users no control. It's designed to be malicious. And many people have installed the Adobe Flash Player because it's gratis. Adobe does not make people pay for the privilege of being abused by this program. That doesn't make it acceptable. It may be gratis, but it's not free software because the users don't have control. So the Adobe Flash Player is malware. Then there is the Amazon swindle. a so-called e-book reader, which is designed to attack the traditional freedoms of readers. For instance, there is the freedom to buy a book anonymously by paying cash, which is the only way I buy books. So Amazon takes that away with the swindle, because the only place to obtain most modern books to read them on the swindle is from Amazon. And Amazon makes the users identify themselves to buy a book, so it's impossible to buy a book with cash and impossible to buy anonymously. Then there is the freedom, and the result is that Amazon manages a list of all the books that each user has bought. And this list is so dangerous to human rights that we can't tolerate its existence anywhere. Then there is the freedom to give a book to someone else, or lend it, or sell it to someone else. Amazon takes away these freedoms with digital handcuffs that stop people from doing it. And also with contempt for the user's private property. Amazon says that the users can't buy a copy, they can only acquire a license to read one under Amazon's choice of conditions. Then there is the freedom to keep a book for as long as you like and read it again as much as you like. Amazon takes away this freedom with a back door. We don't know all of what that back door can do, but we know one thing. It can be used to remotely delete books. We know this by observation. In 2009, Amazon used this back door to remotely delete thousands of copies of a particular book. Copies that the users had bought, well, or obtained a license for from Amazon. And the book with which Amazon demonstrated the Orwellian nature of this product was 1984 by George Orwell. A book that you should all read because it's becoming more relevant to our lives every year. After the outcry that resulted when people observed this, Amazon said, "We'll never do this again unless the state tells us to." I don't find that comforting. I want to have books in a form that can't be remotely deleted by anyone. And I don't want anyone to be able to remotely check that I have them either. So, the Amazon swindle software is malware. The official name of that product is Kindle. Kindle means to start a fire. Evidently, that product's purpose is to burn our books. So, I could go on listing more examples of malware, but this is enough. The most commonly used proprietary programs are designed to mistreat their users. But I won't claim that all proprietary programs have malicious features, because we have no way of checking, because we don't have the source code. When we don't have the source code, we can't study the program to find out whether it has malicious features or not. So I suppose some of them have malicious features and others don't. But since we can't tell which is which, we have to treat all of them as potentially containing malicious features. However, there is a statement I can make about all of them. Their developers are human, so they make mistakes. The code of those programs has bugs. And the user of a program without freedom 1 is just as helpless facing an accidental error as facing an intentional malicious feature. If you use a program without freedom 1, you are a prisoner of the software you use. We, the developers of free software, are human too. We also make mistakes, and the code of our free programs has bugs too. But if you find an error in our code, or anything in our code you don't like, you are free to change it, because we did not make you our prisoner. We can't be perfect. We can respect your freedom. So freedom 1 is essential. But that's not enough, because that's the freedom to personally study and change the source code, or to do it within one organization. That's not enough, because there are millions of users that don't know how to program. They're not capable of directly exercising this freedom. But even those of us who are programmers, even for us, freedom 1 is not enough, because we're busy doing certain jobs, and we don't have time to study all the programs we use. In fact, no user could possibly study and master all the source code of all the programs she uses, or personally implement all the changes she might want, because there are so many free programs already that this is more than any one human being can possibly do. So the only way we can fully have control of our computing is by working together, cooperating. And for this, we need freedom 3, the freedom to distribute copies of your modified versions to others when you wish. This way, it's enough to write the improvement once. If a group of users make an improved version of a free program, then under freedom 3, they can distribute copies to us, they can publish their version if they wish, and then we can all get it, and we can all use it without having to write it again over and over, each one of us. Without freedom 3, yes, each of us would be free to write that improvement, and if we all wanted it, millions of us would have to write the same improvement over and over, which is horribly wasteful. And the people that don't know how to program, they would be excluded. So that's not enough. Freedom 3 is essential also. With freedom 3, once somebody makes the improvement, if she publishes it, then all of us can use it, including those of us who are not programmers. They can use it too, and thus the improvement fully becomes a contribution to society. Thus, freedom 3 is also essential. And the 4 freedoms together give us democracy. A free program develops democratically under the control of its users, because every user is free to participate as much as he chooses in society's decision about the future of the program, which is simply the sum total of the decisions users make for what to do to the program. By contrast, the proprietary program develops under the dictatorship of its developer. The developer has total control. Ultimately, with software, there are just two possibilities. Either the users control the program, or the program controls the users. If the users have sufficient freedom that they control the program, then it's free software. With free software, the users control the program both individually and collectively. So any group of users that want to work together, maintaining a version to serve their needs, are free to do so. And then, if you are one of the people in that group, but you disagree with the rest of the group on a certain point, you're free to change it for yourself that way. And then for others, if anybody else wants your version. But if the users don't have enough freedom so that the users control the program, then the program controls the users. That's proprietary software. The program controls the users, and the developer controls the program, which means the developer controls the users. A proprietary program is an instrument of unjust power. The developer has unjust power over the users. And this is why proprietary software should not exist. Society has a choice to make. On one hand, we have individual freedom, social solidarity, and democracy. On the other, we have the dictatorship of the developer who uses the program to get power over users and then push them around, exploit them, and abuse them. Society must choose free software and reject proprietary software. Thus, the ultimate goal of the free software movement is the liberation of cyberspace and all of its inhabitants, including you. We invite you to escape from the user subjugating software and come and live with us in the free world. The world that we have built so that we and you can live here in freedom. I started the free software movement in 1983. I wanted to use computers and have freedom, which was impossible at the time, because the computer won't do anything without an operating system, which is a collection of hundreds of programs at least. And in 1983, all the operating systems for modern computers were proprietary. So if you bought a new computer, in order to make it useful, in order to make it work, the next thing you had to do was get a license for a proprietary operating system, and there went your freedom. What can I do about that? I was one man, not particularly famous outside of the users of the editor Emacs, and very few people agreed with me. So I didn't think we could get anywhere with an ordinary political movement where you protest in the street and send letters. And besides, I had no experience doing that. I was not a political activist. I was an operating system developer. But then I realized that as an operating system developer, I could tackle this problem in another way. All I had to do was write an operating system. Then I, as the author, could legally make it free software. And then everybody would be able to use their computers in freedom with my system. In other words, I could eliminate this injustice by doing technical work in my own field. So I was aware of an injustice that most people didn't recognize as an injustice. I had the skills necessary to try to correct this injustice, and it looked like nobody else would do this if I did not. That meant I had been elected by circumstances to do this work. It was my duty. It's as if you see somebody drowning and you know how to swim and there's no one else around and it's not Bush, then you have a moral duty to save this person. Perhaps that statement is too strong. We might be able to identify some other people about whom I shouldn't make the claim that you have a duty to save them. Like maybe Cheney and Rumsfeld and Ashcroft and Obama and maybe Putin and, well, maybe some other people as well. Fortunately, I don't need to resolve these questions because I don't know how to swim. However, in my life, the job that really had to be done was not swimming, it was writing lots of code, and that I knew how to do. So I decided to develop a free software operating system, or die trying. Of old age, presumably. Because at the time, the free software movement had no active enemies. A substantial fraction of the people I told the idea to were against it, but they didn't bother doing anything to try to stop me from developing a free operating system because they were sure the job would never be finished anyway. It was so big they thought there was no chance we could ever finish it. Well, I saw that the job was big. I thought we would probably be able to finish it sooner or later. But above all, I knew that failure was not an option. Without a free software operating system, no computer user would ever have freedom. So I decided to develop a totally free operating system. I decided to recruit others to join and help so we would get it done sooner. I decided to follow the basic design of Unix because Unix was a portable operating system capable of running on various different kinds of computers. And probably adaptable to future computers. I also wanted to make a portable system, and following the design of Unix seemed like the best way to assure success of that. And then I decided to make it upward compatible with Unix, which means with the same commands and the same system calls, so that programs written for Unix would run without much change on my system. And users who knew how to use Unix would also know how to use my system without having to learn very much. And this would make it easier for people to switch. And then I gave it the name GNU as a joke. You see, GNU is a recursive acronym. GNU stands for GNU's Not Unix. Programmers love jokes that involve recursion, of course. But that's not enough to make it a good joke. Why GNU and not Inu, FNU, PNU? Well, those are not words. GNU is a word. If it doesn't have another meaning, it's not a joke. So GNU is the name. GNU is the name of this animal that lives in Africa. This is an adorable GNU. that needs a home, and at the end of the speech I'm going to auction it for the benefit of the free software movement. Anyway, but that alone doesn't explain how funny that word is. What really makes this funny is that it's used in lots of jokes. Because according to the dictionary, the G is silent, and the word is pronounced new. So every time you want to write new, instead of spelling it N-E-W, you can spell it G-N-U, and you've got a joke. Perhaps not a very good joke, but there are lots of them. So this word is so charged with humor that as soon as people see the word, they're almost ready to laugh. Given a specific reason to use this as the name of a programming project, I couldn't resist. However, it's important to pronounce the name correctly. Do not follow the dictionary when it's the name of our operating system. Do not pronounce it new, because if you say the new operating system, you'll get people confused. We've been working on it for almost 27 years now, and we've been using it for 18 years, so it's not new anymore. So be sure to pronounce it GNU. The other common pronunciation error that you need to avoid sounds like Linux. A lot of people think that the name of the system is Linux. This is an error, and here's how the error got started. During the 1980s, our work in the GNU project was to find or write all of the hundreds of components we needed for a complete GNU system. By 1992, we had almost everything, but one major essential component was still missing. That was the kernel, which is the program that allocates the machine's resources to all the other programs. We started working on a kernel in 1990, but that particular project has not been a success. It runs, but it doesn't run very well, so we don't recommend people use it. However, fortunately, we didn't have to wait for that, because in 1992, Mr. Torvalds, who had a non-free kernel called Linux, made it free software, and he released it under the GNU General Public License, which was one of the several free software licenses in use at the time. So once Linux became free software, the combination of Linux and the almost complete GNU system made a complete free operating system, which is basically GNU, but also contains Linux. So a good name for it would be GNU plus Linux, or GNU/Linux. However, the people who made the combination were focusing so much on this one piece, Linux, that they perceived all the rest of the system as a small add-on. And so they started calling the whole system Linux, which is unfair to us and confusing. And it gives people the wrong idea of who developed this system and why. So please don't do that. Please don't call the system Linux. Please make the tiny effort required to call the system GNU/Linux. It'll only take you 1 extra second. But it's true that the issue of credit is not the most important ethical issue in life. If it were just a matter of credit, it wouldn't be worth talking about this much. But there's something else much more important at stake in your choice of the name to call the system. Your freedom is at stake. Indirectly, of course, because directly, the name doesn't change the thing. but it does have effects. If you call roses onions, they'll still look and feel and smell the same, but you'll get cooks confused because the cooks wanted some onions and they get roses instead. It won't work. So, and it'll probably cost a lot too much too, right? Anyway, that's an example, but it shows the point. The words you choose determine the message that you communicate to other people, which affects their thoughts, which later guide their actions. So your choice of words does have an effect. Since 27 years ago, the name GNU has been associated with our ideas of freedom that I've told you today. By contrast, the name Linux is associated with different ideas, the ideas of Mr. Torvalds. And what are they? Torvalds never agreed with our ideas of freedom. He rejects them. He says so. He doesn't believe that you deserve freedom. He doesn't believe he deserves freedom either. He says he would happily use a non-free program as long as it's convenient and reliable, which says, in effect, he values convenience and reliability, not freedom. These are essentially the values of an engineer who isn't thinking about the social effects of the technology he makes. Well, he has a right to his views. But it's not right that the tremendous labor we did for the sake of freedom be erroneously attributed to him and serve as his platform for opposing the ideas of freedom that motivated the work. It's not right, and it's dangerous for you, because when people think that the whole system is Linux, they tend to assume that it was started by Mr. Torvalds and that it comes out of his vision of life. So if they admire his work, what they think is his work, then they tend to imitate his vision of life, which means they don't value their own freedom. And then when we have to struggle to defend our freedom, they won't be with us, and we might lose because of that. Sometimes either we all keep our freedom or we all lose our freedom. Freedom is frequently threatened. In order to keep it, we have to defend it. I'm sure you can see that in the history of your own country, and we can also see it by looking at the damage Bush did to human rights all around the world. But in order to defend your freedom, you have to value freedom. In order to value freedom, you have to understand the concept of freedom. In other areas of life, people understand what freedom means, because the debate about human rights in other areas of life has gone on for decades or centuries, which is plenty of time to reach conclusions about what rights people deserve and then spread those ideas around the world. That doesn't assure we always succeed in defending human rights, but at least it creates a basis to try. But computing is a new area of life. It's less than 20 years that most people use computers, even in a few advanced countries, and everywhere else it's less. that's not much time for society to have a debate about what human rights a person deserves in using a program. Not much time, even if society had tried to have a debate. But for the most part, there never was a debate. Almost everyone started using computers with proprietary software, surrounded by other users of proprietary software. Which means, and they didn't know there was any other possibility aside from proprietary software. So they took for granted that proprietary software was a legitimate option. Which means, in effect, that they let the proprietary developers dictate the answer to that question: what human rights do you deserve in using a program? And the answer they chose was essentially none. We can impose anything on you. And thus, there was no debate. However, some of us keep trying to start this debate. We in the free software movement believe we have identified 4 human rights that users of a program deserve. These are the 4 freedoms that define free software. But when we try to bring our ideas of freedom to the attention of the public, and even of the users of our GNU system, we face 2 big obstacles. First of all, the users of the GNU system don't know it's GNU. They think it's Linux. And they think it was all started by Mr. Torvalds and comes out of his vision of life, which they admire. So when they see the articles about the philosophy of GNU and free software, they say to themselves, why should I read that? That's the ideas of these few GNU extremists, and I'm a Linux user, so I don't care what they think. Now, the system they use is really the GNU system, but they don't know that. So this is irony. If they knew that they're using the GNU system, they might say, oh, I'm using GNU/Linux, and these are the ideas of GNU, I should pay attention. And then they would read the articles, and we would have a chance to convince them. And if we succeed, then they might value their own freedom, and they might join us campaigning to win freedom. And that would help our chances of ultimately winning. Well, that's one obstacle, but today there's another, which is that mostly they've never heard the term free software either. Because most people use a different term, open source. A term that was invented specifically so they could avoid talking about freedom, so they could hide the ethical ideas that I've told you today. Free software and open source refer to almost the same class of programs, but not exactly the same class. They have accepted a few programs that we think are too restrictive. But the big difference is at the philosophy, because free software stands for an ethical idea, a philosophy based on values of freedom and community. But open source is a different idea, based on different values. The supporters of open source don't say that a non-open source program is an injustice. The strongest criticism that they're willing to make is that those programs are likely to have more bugs. They say that they recommend a development model that will usually result in better quality software, which means that they are appealing only to values of practical convenience and not making a good ethical society. So at the level of values, the deepest level of all, our philosophy and their philosophy are totally different. How did this happen? During the 1990s, as the GNU/Linux system spread among IT professionals for the most part, some of them discovered that it was very convenient. It was powerful, it was reliable, it was efficient, and you didn't have to pay for permission to run it. So they were very happy and they recommended the GNU/Linux system to their friends, but they didn't think about freedom. They probably never heard the idea that this was about freedom, and so they didn't tell their friends about that. The result was that there were two philosophical political camps within the community. There was the camp of the free software movement, those of us who valued freedom, and then there was the other camp, the camp of the people who liked the same software but only for convenience reasons. And they only valued convenience. So there was a debate between these two camps about the values. But then in 1998, the people in that camp switched to a different term, open source. One of the reasons they liked that term was that there was nothing in it that would lead anybody to think about freedom, because they didn't want to teach, they didn't want to mention any or raise any issue of freedom. And the open source term enabled them to get what they wanted. Because it was a new term that had not been used before, they were able to choose which ideas to associate with their term and which ideas to leave out. So they left out the entire ethical level of the discussion. In 1998, there were already many companies involved with free software. They distributed free software, they developed free software, but most of those companies also distributed proprietary software. And they didn't want the users, who were their potential future customers, to learn to value freedom, because if that happened, they wouldn't be potential customers for a proprietary program. So those companies were happy to switch to the term open source and avoid raising the issue of freedom. And the politicians and the journalists followed the companies. And since then, most discussion of our work has misleadingly described our work as open source. The result is that nowadays, when people hear about us, they hear about us in a misleading way that gives the impression we are supporters of the open source idea. Articles will mention my name, but they won't mention what I stand for, so what good is that? In fact, I've seen articles that called me the father of open source. Which is sort of like calling Gorbachev the father of Georgia. So I sent letters to the editor saying, if I'm the father of open source, it was conceived through artificial insemination using stolen sperm without my knowledge or consent. And then I went on to explain the ideas of free software, because that was the purpose of the letter, to show the readers the ideas that were missing from the previous article. But this work continues. This year I saw articles that talked about me and described my work as open source and thus were totally misleading. We have to keep working hard to overcome these obstacles if we want the users to understand what the issue is. And we need your help. For instance, you could learn to give speeches like this and explain the ideas of free software. I learned to do it, and you can learn to do it. But that takes a lot of work. If you don't have that much time, if you're willing to give just a few seconds a day, you can help us by calling the system GNU/Linux and by talking about free software and not open source. And when you see a discussion going on about what software to use, in which people are looking at the issue purely in terms of convenience, you can point out that there are ethical issues as well, that there is software which is just and software which is unjust. And every time you do this, it will advance the movement because you will educate people. Sometimes you will win and convince people to use the free programs, and other times you won't win. But either way, you achieve something because you educate people to be aware that there are ethical issues here. We need to do this because life offers many opportunities to lose your freedom if you don't decide to keep it. If we could magically have free software today for every job that people want to do, we could distribute these programs, and tomorrow all users could have freedom in their computing. But would they still be free 5 years from now? Not necessarily. If they don't value their freedom, they might abandon their freedom and lose it. Our community has already lost its freedom more than once because most of the community didn't care enough to hold on to its freedom. For instance, in 1992, Torvalds made Linux free software, and it was combined with the GNU system, and the result, GNU/Linux, made it possible to buy a PC and use it in freedom. But not easily. Back then, installing GNU/Linux was hard, and you had to be a wizard. So people began working on making it easier. They developed various distributions of GNU/Linux designed to be easy to install. A few years later, there were several distributions competing. So the developers of one distribution had the idea that they could gain popularity in competing with the other distros by adding some non-free programs to their distro and presenting those as an advantage. And it worked, because most of the users didn't value freedom. They saw that this was an advantage in convenience, and they didn't recognize that it was a disadvantage in freedom. So then the developers of other distros looked at that and said, uh-oh, they're gaining. We have to do something to stop that. We have to put in proprietary programs in our distro too, so we can say our distro is just as good as theirs. So over a few years, all of the distros put in proprietary software, and they all described this as a good thing. So they were all teaching the users to think that proprietary programs are a good thing, the exact opposite of the free software movement. And once they had all put in proprietary software, there was literally no place that you could go to get a free operating system. 10 years ago, when people asked me, where can I get a copy of this system, I had to tell them, I'm sorry, I don't know any place I can recommend to you, because all of the distributions contain non-free software or lead people towards non-free software, and I can't recommend that. So we had reached freedom and we had fallen back and lost it, because not enough of us appreciated freedom enough to hold on to it. How sad. Well, I'm happy to tell you that today there are completely free distributions of GNU/Linux. For instance, there is Ututo, UTUTO, and there is BLAG, which stands for BLAG, Linux, and GNU, another recursive acronym. And there is GNUsense. And there are a few more. Look in gnu.org/distros for the full list. The distros I mentioned are not the well-known popular distros. Those continue to be non-free. So we have started to recover the freedom that we had achieved and lost, but only started. We have a long way to go to get back to the point where everybody installing GNU/Linux is installing free software only. And then we lost our freedom in another way. Today, the source code of Linux is not free software. Not all of it. Most of it still is free software, but there are many pieces which are not free. If you look at some source files of Linux, you will find some long lists of numbers, up to 300,000 numbers in some of these lists. Well, these lists are really executable programs dressed up as source code. But the real source code for those programs is not available, so they're not free software. In addition, many of them explicitly carry non-free licenses. What happened here? Torvalds never agreed with our ideas of freedom, but for a while, for his own reasons, it suited him to develop Linux, the kernel, in a way that did respect users' freedom. And then, later, it suited him to develop it in a different way, which didn't respect the user's freedom. And he didn't have to do any soul searching about this, because he never believed in freedom anyway. When our freedom depends on somebody that doesn't care about freedom, it's precarious. So nowadays, we have to maintain our own modified version of Linux, which we call Linux Libre, or Linux Libre, if you want to pronounce it in Spanish. Basically, it means Linux that's free as in freedom. And what we do is, every time Torvalds releases a new version, we go through it and we delete those non-free pieces, and that's our new version. It's not a lot of work, but it needs to be done. Unfortunately, although it does result in a copy of Linux that is entirely free software, it doesn't make it possible to use those I/O devices with free software. These non-free pieces are firmware programs, and there are some devices that need them in order to work. And that means We can't use those devices with free software. There's no way. No, and so we want to make it possible to use them, and that requires producing the free firmware to run those devices. That may require reverse engineering. It may require putting pressure on the company to release the firmware. It may not be easy, but that's what we have to do. And until then, we have to avoid those devices. So there are more examples, but I think I've mentioned enough of them. It's easy to lose your freedom if you don't value your freedom, if you don't understand the concept of freedom. And this is why the most important job in the free software movement now is teaching other people to value their freedom, which is what I'm doing here. That's why I give so many speeches, and why we need you to give speeches also, some of you. Because in order to establish freedom in a lasting way, it's not enough just to give people their freedom, because they could throw it on the floor and forget about it unless they appreciate it. So if we want to establish freedom in a lasting way, we have to teach people to demand freedom. And nowadays, governments sometimes pass laws to attack the freedom of software users. The United States practices censorship of software. Specifically, free software that can break digital handcuffs. For instance, DVDs are often made in a way that is designed to restrict the user. The video is encrypted for the specific purpose of restricting the user. So people wrote free software which can do that decryption, and that way it's possible to watch those DVDs using free software. The US has established censorship for that software. And after that, many other countries did also. The European Union did. I'm sure if Georgia keeps on following its misguided policy of trying to get too close to Europe and the US, they're going to try to impose those unjust laws on Georgia too. So it's not enough nowadays just to write free programs and distribute them and use them happily. We have to fight to be allowed to develop these programs. And now there are new dangers, new ways you can lose control of your computing. Your browser might be installing non-free programs into your computer and running them without even telling you. Many web pages contain non-free programs written in JavaScript. And browsers typically install these and don't even warn you that they're about to install and run non-free software. So nowadays we have to be on the lookout for that. There are people working on software that will detect non-trivial, non-free JavaScript in web pages and will refuse to run it. So that way you won't be running, by using that software, you'll be able to make sure that you don't run these non-free programs. And there's another way to lose control of your computing without installing any software. It's software as a service. This means that instead of doing your computing by running a program in your own computer, you send the data to some other computer, someone else's server, and your computing gets done there by his choice of software, and you don't control that. And then the server sends the results back to you, or it takes action directly on your behalf. And this way, you don't control your computing anymore. It's the same bad result as if you were using a non-free program, but it arrives through a different means. Through a different, the structure of the problem is different, although the harmful result is the same. So using software as a service is equivalent to using a non-free program in terms of how it affects you. But it's worse than that. Some proprietary programs have spyware features that send information about how the machine is being used, send some of the user's data to somebody's server with special code that has been written to send it. With software as a service, the user has to send all the relevant data to the server. This is required by the structure of the system, and the result is the same. The server gets the user's data, and who knows what the server is going to do with that data. But it's even worse. Some proprietary programs have backdoors, like Windows, for instance, that allow somebody to forcibly change how the user's computing is going to be done. With software as a service, the server operator can always install different software or new programs into that server and change how the user's computing is going to be done. So it's the same result, even though it's achieved without any special code in the user's machine. So software as a service is automatically equivalent to using a proprietary program with spyware and a malicious backdoor. So if you want control over your computing, you must not use software as a service. It's that simple. Nothing can make software as a service acceptable. It always inherently denies users control over their computing, so you just have to refuse to use it. It's not hard to refuse, because software as a service is pretty rare. Most websites just publish information. There's nothing wrong with that. Look at the information if you want. If we look at the websites that provide some non-trivial services, not merely publication, well, most of them are still not software as a service, because what they do for the user is not the user's own computing done on data. In order for it to be your own computing, it has to be done on data that you provide for your purposes. That means it's the kind of thing you could, in principle, do inside your own computer. But most web services do communication and publication, which is not software as a service. So it's a small fraction of the web that you need to avoid for this reason, but it does exist. Google Docs is a good example of software as a service. It invites people to do their word processing in Google's server instead of doing it in their own computers the way people have done it for a couple of decades now. So don't accept that invitation if you want to keep control over your computing. Now, to close, I would like to treat one specific topic: free software and education. If you leave now, you're going to miss the funniest part. So, schools must teach free software and only free software. all educational activities, the entire educational system, morally are obliged to teach free software and only free software. There are 4 reasons for this. The most superficial is to save money. Schools don't have enough money, even in rich countries. They're limited by their budgets. So they should not waste some of their money paying for licenses to use proprietary software. This reason is useful to mention because it's obvious, but it's not very deep. So we should never, and it fails to refer to the essential issue of freedom. So we should never make this the principal reason we mention. We can mention it, but we should always put the emphasis on the ethical reasons. And besides, some and you might wonder, why do I say free software permits cost savings? After all, it's free as in freedom. Free software isn't always zero price. You can buy and sell copies of free software. But once the school system has a copy of a free program, it is free to make many copies and distribute a copy to every school. And then the school is free to use those copies by installing them in all their computers. And if you're free to do something, it means you don't have to ask anybody for permission. You can just do it. So the freedom that comes with the software implies that the school system can arrange to save money. But this superficial reason is sometimes eliminated by proprietary software developers when they offer gratis copies to the schools, gratis copies of their non-free software. And why do they do that? It's because they want to use the schools as instruments to impose a dependence on society, a dependence on their proprietary product. Here's how their plan works. They deliver the gratis copies to the school teaches the students to use them, and the students develop a dependence on that product. And then they graduate, and they still have the dependence. And once they graduate, this company is not going to offer them gratis copies. And they go to work for companies. The developer is not going to offer those companies gratis copies. So the idea is that the school will direct its students down the path of dependence, and the students will pull and drag the rest of society with them into dependence. It's like giving the school needles full of addictive drugs, saying, inject these into your students to make them dependent. The first dose is gratis. Once you're dependent, then you have to pay. The school would reject these drugs, and the school should reject the proprietary software, whether it's gratis or not, because the school has a social mission to educate good citizens of a strong, capable, independent, cooperating, and free society. And in computing, that means teaching people to be free software users, not teaching them proprietary software. But there is a deeper reason for the education of the best programmers. Some people are natural-born programmers. At the age of 10 to 13, they are fascinated with computing, and if they use anything, they want to know how it works. But when the students ask the professor, how does this program do this? If it's proprietary, the professor can only say, I'm sorry, we can't find out because it's a secret, and education cannot begin. Proprietary software is the enemy of the spirit of education, so it must not be tolerated in a school. But if that program is free software, the teacher can explain whatever he knows and then say, here's the source code. Read this and you'll understand everything. And those kids will read it because they're fascinated and they yearn to understand. And the teacher can say, if you come across any point that you can't figure out, show it to me and we'll figure it out together. And that gives a natural-born programmer the chance to learn a very important lesson. That code is not clear. That's the wrong way to write code. If even you can't figure it out, it's very unclear, which means it's a very bad way to write the code. You see, natural-born programmers are very clever. So they can see lots of clever ways to write the code that will work, but other people won't understand them. And that's bad code. Good code is written so other people can understand it. When they see examples of badly written code that they can't understand, they learn the need to write the code so others will understand it. How do you learn to write good, clear code? You learn it by reading lots of code and writing lots of code. Only free software offers people the chance to learn by reading lots of code of programs that we really use. Real examples, not toys. And how do you start writing lots of code? Writing lots of code means writing code for big programs. So how do you start? Not by small programs, because the challenges of big programs don't even begin to appear in a small program. No, you have to write small changes for big programs in order to begin to learn how to write code for big programs, which means you have to write small changes in existing big programs. Only free software gives you the chance to do that, because those are existing big programs you can try changing. This is how I learned to be a good programmer. I worked at the Artificial Intelligence Lab at MIT. My job was system hacker, meaning to improve the operating system. That's what they paid me to do. So I had to, over and over again, read a piece of a large program and make changes in it, and then put it into use, fix the bugs that the users reported, and then go on to another program and do it again. I did it hundreds of times, and eventually I got good at it. Today, any school can offer this kind of opportunity if it is a free software school. But there is an even deeper reason for moral education, education in citizenship. Schools must teach not just facts and skills, but above all, the spirit of goodwill, the habit of helping others. So every class must have this rule. Students, if you bring software to class, you may not keep it for yourself. You must share copies with the others in the class who want copies, including the source code in case someone here wants to learn. Because this class is a place for sharing knowledge. The school has to set a good example, so it has to follow its own rule. The school must bring only free software to class and share copies with everyone in the class, including the source code. This university has to follow this principle. It's a school, and every school has to teach free software and free software only. So those of you who are connected with this university or with any school, if you are the parents of a child who's in school, if you have any kind of connection with a school, it's your duty to campaign for that school to move to free software. When you do that, be persistent, keep looking for more allies, try different methods, and always focus on the ethical level of the issue. The people who don't want to change will have a tendency to sidetrack the discussion into matters of convenience and avoiding work. So you have to respond by bringing things back always to the ethical level. So, for more information, there are some websites you can look at. One of them is GNU.org, which is the website of the GNU project and the free software movement. There is also FSF.org, the Free Software Foundation's website, where you can find various resources that are useful for using free software, and also you can find various political pressure campaigns that you can help. For instance, there is defectivebydesign.org, which is our campaign of protests against digital restrictions management. If you go to that site, you can sign up to be notified of our protests, and then you can help. We need to make these protests large, because the mission is to show large companies that if they design their products to restrict the users, they will be hated. We need your voices joined to ours. That's defectivebydesign.org. At FSF.org, you can also become a member of the Free Software Foundation. You could also do that here, paying in cash if you wish. So, that members paying their dues is how the Free Software Foundation funds the staff. I'm a full-time volunteer. The FSF does not pay me. I ask other people to volunteer. I figure if I set an example of volunteering, it will help. But there are paid staff, and the members are the main source of income to pay them. So now I will present my other identity. If you know anything about this, please don't spoil it for the others. I am Saint Ignatius of the Church of Emacs. I bless your computer, my child. Emacs started out as an extensible text editor that I wrote, which gradually became a way of life for many users, as it was extended so much they could do all their computing inside Emacs. And then it became a church with the launch of the news group alt.religion.emacs, which you might be amused to visit. In the Church of Emacs today, we have no services, only software. We have a great schism between several rival versions of Emacs, and we also have saints, but fortunately no gods. Instead of gods, we adore the one true editor. In the Church of Emacs, well, to be a member of the Church of Emacs, you need to recite the Confession of the Faith. You need to say, there is no system but GNU, and Linux is one of its kernels. Then, if you become a real expert, you can celebrate that with our ceremony, the Fubar Mitzvah, in which you chant part of our sacred scripture, the system source code. We also have the cult of the Virgin of Emacs. The Virgin of Emacs is anyone who has not yet used Emacs. According to the Church of Emacs, offering the virgin the opportunity to lose Emacs virginity is a blessed act. We also have the Emacs pilgrimage, which consists of invoking all the commands of Emacs in alphabetical order. No one knows what the result of that would be. The Church of Emacs has certain advantages compared with other churches I won't name. For instance, to be a saint in the Church of Emacs does not require celibacy. But it does require living a life of moral purity. You must exorcise whatever evil proprietary operating systems have possessed computers under your control, and then install a wholly free operating system. It's not easy drinking with a Halo on. And then only use and install free software with and on the system. If you make this vow and you live by it, then you too will be a saint and you'll have the right to wear a halo. If you can find one, because they don't make them anymore. People sometimes ask whether it is a sin in the Church of Emacs to use the other editor, VI. It's true that VI is the editor of the beast. But using a free implementation of VI is not a sin, it's a penance. People have sometimes asked whether my Halo is really an old computer disk. This is no computer disk, this is my Halo. But it was a computer disk in a previous life. So thank you. Now it's time for the auction of the adorable GNU. This is an adorable GNU that needs a home. And I'm going to auction it on behalf of the free software movement. So, if you are the purchaser of the GNU, then I'll be happy to sign the card or the body of the GNU. It's easier to see on the card, but I'll do whichever one you prefer. If you have a penguin, then you need a GNU, because as we all know, a penguin can hardly function without a GNU. When you bid, please wave your arm and shout out the amount you are bidding. The point is, you want me to notice you. It's useless to bid and not be noticed. So, let's see. So I guess I'm going to start at 50 gel, which is about the same amount that I'd start at in any country. But do I get 50? Do I have a bid? I've got 50 over there. Okay, I've got 50. Do I get 55? Say what you're bidding. I've got 55. Do I get 60? 60. I've got 60. Do I get 65? I've got 65. Do I get 70? I've got 65. Do I get 70? I've got 70. Do I get 75? What did you say? I've got 75. Do I get 80? I've got 75. Do I get 80? I've got 75. I've got 150. He outbid himself. I've got 150. Do I get 160? I've got 150. Do I get 160 for this adorable picture? I've got 150. Do I get 160? $160 to the free software movement to defend your freedom? Not dollars, sorry. Do I get 160? Last chance to bid 160. Going, gone for 150. Please go down. Would you like me to sign it? And if so, where? Sign it here, on the card. Okay. So, you prepared to pay? Okay. So now it's time to answer questions. Now, I am sort of deaf, so in order for me to hear you, you need to speak loud and slowly, even with a microphone.
I don't exactly understand the subject about paying paying with free software. Pricing.
Okay.
Pricing, yeah.
Well,
for example, sorry, I just bought the software. If I can redistribute it without legal pricing, so how can
okay. With free software, your copy is your property, and you're free to make more copies, which are also your property. And then you can sell them. Or you can give them away.
But others can sell.
Yes, when you redistribute it as free software, then other people have copies which are their property, and they can make more copies, and they can give them away or sell them. Because everybody has these freedoms. So it's true that if you're selling a free program, selling copies of a free program to be precise, you are not likely to be able to charge very high prices. The companies that distribute proprietary software, they are charging rent. In economic terms, that's what it's called, it's rent. And that enables them to demand a lot of money, which is what tempts them to engage in this evil practice in the first place. But with free software, nobody has power over anybody else. So nobody is in a position to charge rents, which is good.
Thank you.
Hello, I have a question. What's your point of view for Oracle and Java?
Well, I am worried about Oracle to some extent, but at least Java is there is a Java platform which is available as free software, and we're free to use that.
Yeah, but do the software that we write in Java can become vulnerable to the threat of Oracle?
I don't think so. And the reason is, Oracle itself has distributed the the code of the Java platform under GPL version 3. And it's therefore bound to respect our freedom by having done so. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
You have to speak a little slower.
Okay, no problem. So, speaking of Oracle and speaking of something that was bought by Oracle, another giant comes to mind that is Novell. And as we know,
Novell, yeah.
It is up for grabs, and we know, and I'm sure there will be some patent trolls just dying to buy this company, as it poses a large patent pool. And I'm just wondering, I'm sure this patent trolls, behind the patent trolls will be Microsoft, with its huge sums of money and its power. So what is the strength of free software because of this? What patents does the Novell possess that may threaten free software?
I don't know the answer to that. In general, the only way we will be safe from software patents is by not allowing them to exist. And that's what we need to do. Now, this is a decision that each country makes. If Georgia has no software patents, at least you are safe here.
And what about Mono?
What about Mono?
What's up with that? So what's the
Well,
deal?
Mono is a free implementation of C# together with some .NET libraries. We know that some of those .NET libraries are under patents of Microsoft, and therefore using them is dangerous. And we recommend that people not write their software in C#. Mono itself is a good thing. There are people with C# programs. It's good that we have a free implementation of C#. It's good that we have those free libraries that are like .NET, because it's better to have them than not have them. But writing software that needs them makes you vulnerable.
In what way?
Microsoft might sue you for patent infringement.
Is it smart to include Mono in distribution?
I don't know. What I think is most important is to reject software, other software written in C# from the distributions.
I have a question. Here, can you explain a little bit more about the copyleft?
Copyleft is a technique that I invented, a legal technique, for use in free software licenses. A free software license means any license that, for software that gives the user the 4 freedoms. So there are lots of free software licenses. Some of the free software licenses do copyleft. You see, some free software licenses are very permissive. They permit somebody to get a copy of the code and put it into a proprietary program, which means redistributing some of our code as proprietary software to other people. And this way, the end users don't get freedom. I had already seen that practice in 1985 when I first had some GNU software to release. And I wanted to make sure that did not happen to GNU. I wanted to make sure that all users of this code would get freedom, which meant that all modified versions of the code had to be free software, and they had to be distributed to users as free software. So I invented a way to require that legally using copyright law, using the copyright on my code. And that method is copyleft, and here's how it works. The license says you are authorized to distribute exact copies. You are authorized to distribute other works containing some of this code. But there is a condition. When you distribute any such thing, you must provide the source code. You must distribute under this same license and you must give the users a copy of the license so they know their rights. Those are the specific requirements that implement copyleft, and the effect of copyleft is those users have to get it as free software also. So, if we look at all the free software licenses, some of them are copyleft licenses, and some of them are non-copyleft licenses. They all respect the user's freedom. Copyleft licenses go further, and they actively defend the freedom of all users.
I have a question about freedom of view. But before this, I must admit some facts. According to BSA, Georgia is #1 country distribution of virus, and even.
Well, wait a sec. A virus? I'm not in favor of computer viruses.
No,
that has nothing to do with
no,
this
virus.
issue. Of what?
Pirate software.
Oh, well, that's propaganda. You shouldn't call it that. The fact that they use that term shows that they are evil.
Yes.
Don't imitate them, because if you imitate them, you're spreading their message.
So, I have a question about pirate software and the freedom of
Pirates don't use software. They use guns.
I must say that in our country,
I can't hear you. You're a what?
in Georgia, even banks and internet service providers have portals from where you can download this proprietary software for free. And I say that if we give people choice, pay or not to pay for our free software, most of them will not pay, I think.
That's life. But that's true everywhere. Most people download the software, and sometimes people will send money to the developers, but mostly they don't.
Yes, but if I am programmer and I am making money writing my programs and nobody will pay.
Well, okay, but listen. You're making confused assumptions. Obviously, you're not going to be making money from developing free software unless you have found a business model. And some people have found business models, but they are specific to particular packages. There is no general answer. And the fact is, most developers of free software are volunteers. So you can be a volunteer and contribute to free software in your spare time. Of course, you won't work 40 hours a week of spare time. If you have a job, then you don't have 40 hours a week of spare time, but you might have 10. So you'll contribute less, but at least it's something. At least you're doing some of something good. It's better to do a small amount of something good than a lot of something bad.
Thank you.
So if you need to get a job, okay, I'm not going to say you shouldn't have a job, but don't have a job writing proprietary software, because that's immoral, that's an attack on society. Get some other kind of job. Now, one kind of job you might get, which can be done ethically, is developing custom software. Most paid software development is custom software, not meant to be released as proprietary software products. Custom software, should I wait for people to be ready to listen? I'm waiting. Oh, no, I haven't finished. I'm waiting for people to be quiet so I can continue. Most paid software development is custom software, which means one client is paying for the development, and that client wants to use that software. Now, this is perfectly possible to do as free software. The same client is going to have to pay the same amount. So, the result is most software most programming jobs can be done in a free software world. You just have to deliver the results to the client as free software, and that can be specified in the contract. But the same client's going to have to pay, because otherwise nobody's going to write that program.
Can I ask you about the unfriendly Facebook?
Oh, Facebook is a bad thing. Because its business model is based on collecting people's personal information and misusing it. There are other bad things about Facebook. For instance, it distributes video in Flash. Flash format is not fully supported by free software and shouldn't be used. Another bad thing about Facebook is it's a platform for other services, and some of those are software as a service. Facebook's basic activity is not software as a service, it's communication. I don't think that social networking in general is bad, but there are good and bad ways to do it, and Facebook is a bad way. Another thing that Facebook does or has done is claim unlimited rights to use the works that users post in their Facebook accounts, which is unfair to those users. And so use some other social networking site, not Facebook. And I put a button in stolmani.org that is a parody of other people's buttons that they use to promote Facebook, which is a really stupid thing to do. Why are you promoting a company? If you were doing it for money, I would lose respect for you. But if you're doing it and not even getting paid, why in the world do you do that? But in any case, mine says not effed.
Can I add something? And still, here is a Facebook era now in Georgia, you know, everyone are there. And it's
You're exaggerating. Is there anyone here who does not use Facebook? Okay, it's not everybody. Don't exaggerate. Don't be defeatist.
But still, it's like a free space for discussions, you know. In Georgia,
there are lots of places to have discussions.
Yes, that's right. But still, Facebook is also, and there are.
Well, use another one. Discussions are useful, but you don't have to use a predatory company like Facebook as your platform.
Which one?
Probably, I have no specific one to recommend, but there are so many. There are so many ways to have discussions.
Okay, and if I can ask one more question about a little bit philosophical. You know, internet became as a big brother, which is always watching you. Every step you are doing, it's there. So how can we treat this big brother?
Well, you can reduce its ability to track you. For instance, if you browse the web using Tor, then it's not easy for anyone to find out which sites you are looking at. Another crucial point is don't identify yourself to websites. In some cases, to reduce the tracking is extra work. You may need to turn off access to certain sites, sites whose purpose is to track the users. You're looking at site A, but site A contains a little rectangle that connects to site B, and just so that site B can keep track of you, well, you may have to block those sites that are used in that way. But there are things that people can do.
So, can I ask a question? Your ethical moment, I just wonder, how do you think, is it right for you, for example, to software.
To what? Sorry, I can't hear you now. Is it right for me to do what?
To use, no, I would say, is it ethically right to use the software that was downloaded from
Which software?
Non-free software?
What's wrong? It's bad to use non-free software. If you use non-free software, it takes away your freedom. So you should escape from it.
But
I have escaped from it. I don't use that software.
But for example, the guy who downloads that and starts to mess with it, make some changes. And
Well, in general, you can't because proprietary software usually doesn't give people the source code, and it's almost impossible to make changes.
yeah, but maybe it's all about making lesser evils of it.
I don't understand. Why choose the lesser evil? We have the option of being good by using free software.
But if you are not deep into computing, sometimes
It's got nothing to do with
necessary.
it. You're wrong. You're wrong. When you say it's necessary to use a non-free program, you're exaggerating. It might be inconvenient not to use that program, and you're exaggerating inconvenient into impossible. And that's what people do to make an excuse to do something that's bad.
Yeah, okay.
It may require a sacrifice. To keep your freedom may require a sacrifice. And that's not unusual. Freedom often requires a sacrifice. We keep our freedom if we are willing to make the sacrifice.
Okay, thank you.
As you said, the main thing GNU use is freedom. So why do we need to have GPL versions differ from
Oh, well, I'll tell you why. Because GPL version 1 was not perfect. I published GPL version 1 in 1989, and it dealt with the dangers and problems and issues that I knew about. But at that point, I then discovered that there was a situation that it didn't handle. That there was because GPL version 1 assumed that an operating system was distributed as a single collection. And then I discovered that there were non-free systems where the compiler was distributed separately from the rest of the system. And GPL version 1 had bad consequences in that case. And I also found out about the danger of software patents and the danger that a patent holder might use software patents to pressure somebody into distributing the program without the required freedom. So for these two reasons, I made changes and produced GPL version 2. That was in 1991. And we used that for a long time, but in the early 2000s, I realized that there were some serious problems that had appeared that GPL2 did not handle well. So I worked on GPL version 3, which came out in 2007. And that was after about 2 to 3 years of work. And GPL version 3 has the same basic purpose as GPL 1 and 2, namely, defend freedom for all users of the software. But in many specific issues, it makes things clearer and does a better job. For instance, there's a new way of taking away users' freedom. And you can find this in many Android phones. Android is free software. At least the source code is available as free software. And part of Android, namely Linux, is released under GPL version 2. So the users can get the source code, but many of these phones do not allow the user to install a modified version. There's a company, whichever company sold the phone can install a modified version, but the user can't, even though the user has bought the phone. So that's not freedom. So GPL version 3 says if you distribute copies in a physical product, and if there is a way to install updated versions or changed versions, then you have to tell the user the information necessary to install them. If you can install changed versions, you have to show the user how to install changed versions. This is the most controversial change in GPL version 3. Torvalds doesn't like this. Torvalds is against users' freedom. He is against protecting users' freedom, and he rejected GPL version 3 precisely because it protects users from this abuse. He firmly decided not to defend the users from this abuse. And what can I do? But many other programs do use GPL version 3, and they do protect the users from this abuse.
I just wonder, why are you using all the time CLI not graphical user?
Because why do I use a text terminal? Because it's more convenient for me. Almost all my work is text. And the easiest way I can work with text is using a text-only terminal. Meanwhile, the pads that you use to move the mouse pointer are extremely inconvenient because they generate clicks when all you want to do is move the pointer. And the spurious clicks generated by that are a horrible pain. So I find it very hard to use that kind of computer in a graphical mode. By using a text-only console, I avoid the whole problem. Please speak louder and clearer. I can't hear you well.
Okay, so I have a microphone and I think it won't be a problem hearing me. So
Wait. He's asking another question.
Okay, I've got another question about Ganesh and what about GNU Hard? I just want to...
Ganesh, those are two questions. Ganesh is the GNU Flash player, which works pretty well now for Flash version 8. But meanwhile, Adobe came out with Flash version 10, and they redesigned the virtual machine, which means we have to now start from scratch to support Flash version 10. And the GNU Herd is our kernel that we started in 1990. It's making a little progress. Some volunteers are working on it, but not much. However, what we really need at the level of the kernel is not replacing the free parts of Linux. What we need is free drivers and free firmware for the devices that don't have them. That's the way, if you want to do something at the level of the kernel that will really help our community, that's what you should do. Reverse engineer these I/O devices and write free drivers for them.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So I have a question regarding the model of using the free software, because here were the questions from programmers. How would they work with the free software? So
I don't understand that.
Okay, so you said that one of the models is like the organization provides the free software and then hires the programmers to customize it.
Yes.
So I have a question. How you're going to control the quality of the software development project?
I don't understand what you mean by that. It's too vague. There are several different parties in this scenario. Who are you talking about?
So say I'm an organization and I want to use the free software.
Yes.
But this free software needs to be customized, so it lacks
Yes.
the functionality I demand. I hire the programmers, the team of the programmers, and I engaged into software development projects. My question is, so if I lack the appropriate resources, because most of the free software is written on C++, it's written
Sorry, get out of those details. This is a very simple question. You're hiring people to do this job, and you want to check if they've done a good job.
Yes.
Well, how would you check if they did any other job well? Suppose you hire plumbers to change the plumbing in your building. How are you going to check?
Okay, the problem is that you cannot compare the number of plumbers with the number of programmers in certain locations. So maybe...
I don't understand that's a very vague statement. It might be true, but I don't know what it means.
This means that, Mr. Stolman, we're in Georgia, it's a small country, so we cannot afford, running the free software project and free software customization project at every location.
Well,
so
I don't understand. I never said you should. Most people use free software the way it comes. Why would you change it? Well, you have to be strongly motivated. If you're going to have to pay someone to change it, well, you'll only do that if you really want it.
Yeah, because this actually happened when, in all the schools in Georgia, they installed Linux.
No, they didn't. They installed GNU plus Linux. You're insulting us.
They installed GNU/Linux, and then, because of the lack of support, in fact, they had to move to Microsoft Windows, in fact, because the last year they purchased the 25,000 licenses for Microsoft Windows.
Well, I'm very sad to hear that. They made a mistake. I'm sure they could have bought, they could have educated people to provide the support for less money than it's going to cost them now, but they were fools. However, all I can say is that it has worked much better in other places. The poorest part of Spain decided to advance by using free software in the schools, and they changed almost 10 years ago, and it worked out for them. So then another part of Spain decided to follow them, and it worked out for them too. Without telling me the details of the problems, I can't possibly suggest any solution. All you're basically saying is sometimes it's too hard, and how can I respond to that?
No, okay, so I guess the problem is maybe in the level of education in IT and the number of professionals who are engaged with this, but
I don't know.
In general, it appears that free software is poorly supported. So there are lots of vendors, specialists, people who are proficient with Microsoft.
Well, you see, this is part of the problem we have to change. This is an example of social inertia. When you have something big like the society as a whole, which is moving in a certain direction, yes, it's hard to push it to another direction. But this is what we have to change. You can look at the inertia as an excuse to give up, or you can regard it as part of the problem we must change. When you see that use of Windows takes away the user's freedom, then you conclude we have to change this. If the problem is because there are a lot of people who know how to use Windows and only a few who know how to use GNU/Linux, well, we have to change that. But the government could have paid people to first of all, learn how to work with GNU/Linux and then provide support. It didn't do that. Whereas, I suppose in Spain, they did pay people. And I know, for instance, they trained people to train the teachers. And I was involved in part of that because I was brought there to train those people about the GNU philosophy. Of course, they also had to be trained in the practical aspects of how to use the system so that they could teach all the teachers both of these things. Now, Andalusia, which was the second region that changed, has a population of around 7 million. How many people live in Georgia? About 3 million. Well, it's a smaller problem.
I'm an intensive user.
I have to take a break. I'm sorry. I'll be back.